Welcome to the 17th Annual Malcolm Comeaux Lecture. So where's Malcolm? Malcolm, can you stand up and give Malcolm a round of applause? You can't hear me? Okay. So Malcolm Comeaux, this lecture series is in honor of him, and it was established by our school around the time when Malcolm was retiring. That was quite a while ago, and he's still here on almost a daily basis, heavily involved in the Geographic Alliance. He contributed to our school in so many ways for so many years, running the Geography Club and Honor Society, GTU, starting the fundraising group, Friends for Geography, which we are bringing back and having a first meeting with alumni, I think April 19th, I believe. So thank you, Malcolm, for all that you've done for the school. Well, I'm going to next introduce our Comeaux lecturer, Andy Goetz. I've known Andy since at least 30 years. And he's the first person I thought of when they asked for nominations for the speaker, partly because his work has moved into the area right in the middle of planning and geography. And so he's a perfect speaker for this session. So a little bit about Andy's background. He has a PhD in geography from Ohio State University, where he studied with Ned Tafe. Ned Tafe was the sort of the dean of transportation geographers for many years, and the first winner of the Ullman Award from the Transportation Geography Specialty Group, which Andy himself won in 2010. I knew Andy's work very well. Those of my students who take geographical analysis of transportation read his articles on airline deregulation. His work in the airline field, which he did for the early part of his career, and still does, is tremendously good work in combining theory and empirical analysis and policy and history. So I have my students read his paper on the effects of the deregulation of the airline industry, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's a great reading. But more recently, Andy has moved into the area of rail transportation, light rail, high-speed rail. He combines transportation studies with land use studies, so transit-oriented development, aerotropolis, is that how you say it? Well, aerotropolis, the singular is much easier. He's written, co-edited, and written several books on the airline industry. He's got one coming out with the University of Pennsylvania Press on Metropolitan Denver. He was associate editor of Journal of Transport Geography for many years, chair of the Transport Geography Specialty Group. But one of the really interesting things in his background is how involved he is in policy. So here are some of the local organizations that Andy is involved with in Colorado. The Statewide Freight Advisory Council, the State Freight and Passenger Rail Plan Development Group, the Denver International Airport Community Focus Group, the Transportation Advisory Committee for the City and County of Denver Strategic Transportation Plan, and the Transportation Advisory Committee for the Denver Regional Council of Governments. So, I mean, Michael Crow would be really, really happy with one of our professors having that kind of a profile of community engagement and applying their expertise to help the community. So with that long-winded introduction, let me introduce Professor Andrew Goetz from University of Denver, who's going to talk about metropolitan regionalism and collaboration in support of rail transit and transit-oriented development, the Denver case.
Thank you, Mike. That was very kind. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you. Thanks to Malcolm Comeaux for the lecture series, and for your support in inviting me to come and be a part of this celebration. So I'm really happy to be here. I've enjoyed being here the last few days. Had a chance to go to some spring training baseball games while I've been here. Last night we went to the game downtown and took the light rail to go there, so it was quite a nice experience. Not quite. The light rail was packed, yeah, but the game itself wasn't packed. So yeah, it's been a great time being here. I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and I look forward to talking with you today, presenting a little bit of the research that I've been doing recently, and to having a nice question and answer period at the end of it. So one thing I do want to say, though, I really do appreciate the introduction by Mike. He was very kind, very gracious in his comments, and I would like to say that I've really enjoyed the collaboration and camaraderie with Mike over these last 30 years. We see each other just about every year when we go to the AAG meeting, and our career paths have been sort of, parallel, and we do many similar things, so it's been great having a colleague like Mike. So let me just say a few things about what the presentation's going to be. Many of you may have heard something about the city of Denver, Colorado, and what's been happening there in terms of growth and transportation. And so I got interested in it back, probably about 20 years ago or so, when there first started to be this interest in developing rail transit and changing the approach towards regional planning in the Denver metropolitan area. And the more that I learned about it, the more intrigued I got, and that led me to kind of get much more involved in terms of research there. And I had been doing a lot of air transport research, like Mike was saying, but increasingly found myself gravitating towards what was happening in terms of rail transit and TOD, and particularly with the sustainability implications associated with it. I got very, very interested in what was going on. First, let me just make some acknowledgments here that a lot of this research that I've done has been supported by University Transportation Center, the National Center for Intermodal Transportation, which was a combination between University of Denver and Mississippi State University. So there were several projects that were supported by this UTC, and this research I'm going to be presenting today is kind of a summary or a mix of the findings from several of these studies. This talk is going to be composed of two parts. The first part is going to be looking at this issue of collaboration and regionalism and how it plays a role in terms of supporting transport infrastructure development with a case focus on Denver. And then I'll focus after that on the issue of rail transit and urban form and TODs, and then how that has played out in the case of Denver. And so I hope you'll enjoy this. I think it has a lot of applicability to what's been happening here in Phoenix. And so we'll get started with it. So the first thing I wanted to say is just when thinking about urban areas in the United States, we can conceptualize a very simple diagram of how metropolitan areas have grown over time. From initial central cities, growing outward and annexing land, eventually a number of suburbs started to pop up at independent political jurisdictions in the fringe. And as the city continued to grow, there was this proliferation of independent municipalities, independent political jurisdictions. While the city as a whole, economically, was growing out, and if you just happen to see it from the air, you can't really tell that there are these sorts of distinctions. But in political terms, the political boundaries had some very real consequences. It made it a lot more difficult to be able to plan at a regional scale. And so, this is the sort of political geography that many of our urban areas are faced with today. So you could kind of conceive of this as sort of a four-stage process, where at the beginning you had city expansion and consolidation, where the central city would just simply annex land and incorporate more of the outlying territory, followed by a phase of fragmented suburban growth in which a number of these independent jurisdictions were formed and in many cases developed somewhat hostile relationships with each other and with especially the central city. That's led to a phase, at least in some places, of increasing regional collaboration. And it's happened through two ways. One, through formal governance structures like designated metropolitan planning organizations or transit agencies, but increasingly through a number of informal structures, what are sometimes referred to as new regional collaborations. And we'll talk about that a little bit more today. And then finally, sort of the next phase in the process, and that's extended regionalism, where we're seeing the development of mega regions, multiple metropolitan areas that are coalescing and deserve more attention because of the interaction that's taking place between and among these multiple metropolitan areas. So with regards to this concept of new regionalism, this has been something that's been of interest to a number of scholars at different spatial scales, different geographical scales. At the nation-state level, there's been challenges from supranational organizations as well as from local and regional groupings. For our purposes today, we're really focused on metropolitan areas and how these metropolitan areas can and sometimes do come together to solve problems of regional interest, to solve and address infrastructure problems. So new regional collaborations have been created, and these have come about through different, sometimes unorthodox structures. There have been more grassroots organizations that have come together to get around some of the more formalized structures. The Alliance for New Regionalism is one of those organizations. In Denver, an outgrowth of that is a group called Civic Results. And their main purpose was really to try to bring together entities within a metropolitan area to come to grips with solving regional issues, to kind of put parochial interests aside and think in more regional terms. And as I said, a lot of this has been applied to transportation infrastructure provision. We could kind of think about how transport infrastructure has been provided over time in this country in a series of phases or stages. In the early years, it was mostly at the local level and also with private providers, like, say, for instance, the early streetcars in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Those were all private companies that initially were providing those things, local streets by local governments. But with the onset of the automobile and the urge to build more roads, we developed this state and federal partnership where the U.S. federal government provided a 50-50 match at first, which was then later expanded to a 90% federal share during the period of the interstate highway system. State and local governments only needed to provide 10%, 90% covered by the federal government. Also during this time, transit shifted from private provision to public. Last phase has been this move into the era of new federalism and neoliberalism, where the federal role has receded. The funding amounts coming from the federal government have been reduced, and instead states and metro areas are expected to come up with a larger share of it. And that's created some real difficulties in terms of being able to generate enough funding to be able to support infrastructure provision, which has led to the development of public-private partnerships to support infrastructure expansion. One of the things that also has been going on in the more recent period, last 20 to 30 years or so, has been growing support for rail transit and TOD. And this picture kind of says it all here. You know, people don't want to be stuck in traffic like this. It's soul-crushing, mind-numbing, something that is increasingly to be avoided at all costs. And it's led many to consider, what are the alternatives to this? How can we get out of this kind of gridlock situation? And that's led to reconsidering and rethinking the value of transit, and specifically rail transit. And so with that has come as well the urge and desire to live in places where you're not always so dependent on the automobile, where you can take transit, you can bike, you can walk, you can live in a surrounding and work in a surrounding where you're not always having to hop in your car. And so all of these movements, all of these forces have been pushing us in the direction towards building more new rail transit systems, investing more in them. This is just a map from a Reconnecting America study that looked at how many projects were actually being built in the United States. This comes from 2013. And they found that there were 721 fixed guideway projects that were in some stage of construction or of planning in that year. So it represents a fairly significant increase over what had been previously the case, where rail transit had not really been getting a whole lot of attention. More and more cities across the country found that it really made sense to be thinking about investing in rail transit. If you can't read some of the numbers here, it just shows the number of projects for each of the metro areas. And according to this, the Washington-Baltimore area had the largest number of 45. The Los Angeles area was second on this list with, I think, 40 was the number that they had. This doesn't tell you the size, the magnitude of the projects. If you look at the dollar amounts, then it's going to be a different thing. But it still gives you an indication of how much interest there has been in doing it. Well, one of the places where rail transit has been developed, where there's been quite a bit of interest in it, is Denver, Colorado. And so this next phase, I'd like to just talk a little bit about how rail transit became supported through increasing regional collaboration in the case of Denver. Just a few things, geography about the Denver metro area. This map shows the Denver Aurora, now Denver Aurora Lakewood Metropolitan Statistical Area. It is up to just over 3 million population now today, been growing very rapidly. It does not include, technically it does not include Boulder or Boulder County, although Boulder and Boulder County are part of the Regional Transportation District. So in terms of transit planning, it is a part of the region, and it's also the part of the region for metropolitan planning. The Denver Regional Council of Governments includes that as well. The whole Front Range corridor from Fort Collins in the north through Boulder and Greeley, Denver, and then down to Colorado Springs and even farther south to Pueblo has also been growing. So that is another one of these emerging mega regions, and there's increasing interest in developing a passenger rail line, I think a medium speed passenger rail line between those cities, so it wouldn't be high speed. So there's starting to be some interest in moving in that direction. In 2013, there was a book written by Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley from the Brookings Institution called The Metropolitan Revolution. And in this book, they were postulating that while the federal government was in many ways dropping the ball on a lot of urban policies, a lot of infrastructure development, metropolitan areas were actually picking up a lot of the slack and just kind of taking it upon themselves to do what needs to be done. And so they profiled a number of cities in their book. One of those was Denver, and in the chapter about Denver, they identified 4 votes that occurred over a period of 35 years or so that were instrumental in Denver starting to overcome some of the friction and factionalism that typified much of the early post-war period in terms of metropolitan planning and collaboration. The 1974 Poundstone Amendment was really the low point of this process. The other three, Denver International Airport, Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, and of course the FasTracks rail transit expansion, are all evidence of growing support for regional collaboration. The Poundstone Amendment was an amendment that was put forward by Frida Poundstone, who was the mayor of Greenwood Village, a suburb in the southeastern part of Denver, in response to what many suburbs felt was an overly aggressive annexation approach by the city of Denver. Denver was in the midst of trying to annex land to the southwest, to the southeast, and to the northeast. And a number of suburban jurisdictions felt that Denver was really trying to overreach. This also had racial overtones to it because it was right at the time when school busing for desegregation was implemented in Denver as a result of the Keys versus Denver School District case. It was the first case of school desegregation outside of the South. And the judge in that case ruled that the Denver School District had been discriminating and that it needed to be completely desegregated. It had to be dismantled, what they referred to as root and branch, in order to overcome the policies that the Denver School District had been putting in force. So while that addressed what was happening in Denver, many of the suburban jurisdictions were very concerned about being caught into the desegregation busing plan. And so they really wanted to limit Denver's ability to annex. And statements like this, very militaristic in tone, kind of illustrates just how heated the opposition was. This was a statewide amendment to the Colorado Constitution, so they needed to get the entire state to vote for it. And many of the suburban jurisdictions were able to rally the support of rural areas in western Colorado and eastern Colorado, especially western Colorado, by threatening that if Denver gets bigger, they're going to siphon more of the water off of the western slope and bring it to the Denver metro area. And western slope communities are very fearful of water grabs by the metro area, especially by Denver, because Denver Water is the biggest water supplier in the area. So that was another piece of the puzzle that got the support for this Poundstone Amendment. So what did it do? It basically limited Denver's ability to annex. Previously, Denver or any county could just simply get the vote of the people who lived in the area that was to be annexed. The Poundstone Amendment required that the entire county from which those parcels would be annexed had to vote in favor of the annexation. And since these counties were in no way interested in having Denver annex more land, it effectively ended Denver's ability to annex land going farther out. Major step. This troubled history of city regionalism in Denver also has a number of sub-chapters associated with it. While the predecessor to the Denver Regional Council of Governments, MPO, was created in the 50s, it really didn't do a whole lot for a long period of time. It didn't have much authority, much power, and so it played a very subsidiary role in the process of planning. There were some pretty striking freeway protests in Denver in the 60s and 70s. This map that I've put up here shows the extent of the proposed freeways in the Denver region. And I'll just say that it doesn't look anything like this today. There are way more freeways that were proposed to be built than actually did get built. Many of these were stopped. A couple of the ones that would have gone right through downtown Denver probably would have taken out Union Station, which is the main train station in downtown Denver. Also, the intersection of two of these freeways would be right where Coors Field is today in downtown Denver. So if those highways were built, Coors Field wouldn't be there. It'd be a completely different environment, different landscape. The whole lower downtown area would be completely changed. The Regional Transportation District, the transit agency, was created in 1969, another effort at regionalism, but they had a very tough time getting support across the board. So it took a long time for that to happen. There were a number of conflicts around the 1976 Winter Olympics. Denver was initially awarded the Winter Olympics for that year, but in 1972, a statewide referendum voted them down based on concerns about the environment and also the finances associated with the Olympics. So Denver, as far as I know, is the only city to have been awarded the Olympic Games by the International Olympic Committee and then to have turned them down. There's a move to try to get the Olympics to come back to Denver, the Winter Olympics, and I think they're talking about 2026 or something like that. But I don't think that the IOC is ever going to vote in favor of Denver again because of what happened back in the 70s. So both DRCOG and RTD just had a lot of difficulties over this time. And another transit plan in 1997 was defeated. So even as late as 1997, there wasn't the kind of support that later emerged. The beginnings of regional collaboration really started with Denver International Airport. The planning for this began in the early 1980s when it was realized that as a result of deregulation that air traffic was growing very rapidly in Denver, and the existing airport at Stapleton was just simply too small to be able to handle that increased air traffic. It had become surrounded by development on three sides, and the fourth side was an area called the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which manufactured nerve gas and chemical weapons during World War II and had become one of the most polluted pieces of ground in all of North America. And so there were real questions and troubling concerns about expanding an airport onto such a contaminated site. And so that led to considering building an entirely new airport at a site farther away from the city itself. Support for this was pretty strong across the board, particularly from the Chamber of Commerce. And a new way of thinking about the region was introduced here. The Denver Metro Chamber president felt that we needed to be looking at this region as you would see it from the air, as opposed to all of the political boundaries on the map. And so that was really the beginnings of this realization that maybe we do need to be thinking about it in these terms. In order for this to happen, Adams County, which is northeast of Denver, had to vote in favor of allowing Denver to annex the land. And they actually did, with strong support from the governor. They voted in favor of it, which is the first and only time that any county around Denver has allowed Denver to annex any land. It was for the airport. So that was a major breakthrough. Growing support for city regionalism also came about through some initiatives from the Metro Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Corporation, which merged together and were thinking about how to keep Colorado, how to keep the Denver metro area more competitive. One of the key factors in bringing together these disparate groups was the formation of something called the Metro Mayor's Caucus in 1993. Prior to that, there was a lot of friction between the jurisdictions. The traditional structures, the MPOs and the Regional Transit District, were more confrontational in nature, while the Metro Mayor's Caucus was created to be a more open and conciliatory organization, a group in which the mayors could just come and talk about these issues and not have to worry about the larger implications. They started thinking in more regional terms at these caucus meetings. They actually held the meetings at the Metro Chamber offices. So it was sort of like under their auspices that the mayors were gathering. And so it really began to change the thinking about how to go forward. Two of the mayors of Denver at that time, in the 90s, Wellington Webb, and then in the 2000s, John Hickenlooper, were also very instrumental in getting more thinking in terms of a regional approach. Hickenlooper in particular, who's now the governor of Colorado, also sometimes rumored to be running for president, although we don't know that for sure. He was very, very instrumental in doing this. He was one of the people who saved Union Station from being demolished in the 1980s because he owned a brew pub right across the street and he wanted to be able to keep his business going. But what he did when he became mayor of Denver is that he took suburban mayors with him on tours and on economic development trips to encourage businesses to think about the Denver area. So he wasn't doing it just for the city of Denver, but he was doing it for all the jurisdictions. And the suburban mayors were really surprised that a mayor of Denver, who they've long had this, animosity with, would be willing to do that. And so it really changed the thinking about how this region as a whole could work together. And that had direct results in terms of an improvement in regional planning at the Denver Regional Council of Governments in the 1990s and 2000s. They began to do a much more focused regional planning approach, realizing that the projected regional build-out was going to be greater than 1,000 square miles, and they didn't want it to be that big. The region had big problems for air quality in the 70s and 80s especially, and it was continuing, so they felt like they needed to do something to get a hold of the air quality problem. Vehicle miles traveled and traffic congestion continued to increase, and there were continued battles over beltways. Some of them were stopped, but others continued to go forward and be built. So there didn't seem to be a whole lot of cohesion around the beltway issue. In 1997, DRCOG put forward their Metro Vision 2020 plan, in which they identified several key elements. First in growth and development was to establish a voluntary urban growth boundary. It would not exceed 700 square miles. They also designated a set of urban centers, and I think about 100 of those, and then freestanding communities in 4 places on the fringe: Boulder, Longmont, Brighton, and Castle Rock. In terms of environment, there was a strong emphasis on preserving air quality, water quality, and having more parks and open space. But what really typified this was in the transportation realm, where there was very strong support issued for a regional rail transit system as the backbone of a transportation and land use plan throughout the entire area. The reintroduction of rail transit in Denver started in the 1990s, and it started in an incremental fashion. In 1994, the initial line was built, 5 Mile Central light rail line. In 2000, the Southwest line, and maybe I can highlight this here. So this is the Central line that goes right up into downtown. This is a blow-up of what that looks like. The Southwest corridor is this one here that goes down to Littleton, 8.7 miles. The Central Platte Valley is this little yellow spur that comes off here that connects all the major sporting venues in downtown Denver. And then the 19-mile southeast line is this one that goes down here all the way down to Lincoln Avenue in Douglas County in the suburban area and goes by the University of Denver as well. So with each of these extensions, expansions, there was growing support, a growing sense that maybe RTD knew what they were doing. There was a lot of skepticism previously that RTD really wasn't up to it, up to being able to spend billions of dollars to build rail lines. But with each of these lines, they came in on time, under budget, and the actual ridership exceeded projections. So they were able to do what they said they were going to do, and that built up a lot of confidence amongst the metro area voters. As a result, RTD felt it was now time to roll out a much bigger plan, and that was came in the form of the FasTracks plan. In 2004, there was a referendum that was put before metro area voters to increase the sales tax by 0.4% and to build with that 122 miles of new commuter and light rail transit, 18 miles of bus rapid transit, and refurbish the Union Station as the central hub of the entire system. So Union Station right here is this red star, and most of the lines would emanate out from Union Station, with the exception of this one here out in Aurora. That would be the only circumferential one. But it's a classic hub and spoke type of network, rail network, focused on downtown Denver. Unfortunately, right after FasTracks was passed, and this is not unusual that this sort of thing happens, but the cost estimates that were originally put forward of $4.7 billion, it was realized that this was going to cost a lot more than what they thought. In fact, the costs eventually went up to as high as $7.8 billion, the estimates were, to finish the whole system. At the same time, sales tax revenues also were not as much as what they had hoped for. Some of that was due to the recession, but some of that was due to just not very good forecasting on their part. So what's happened is that this program has proceeded in a more incremental fashion. They've had to do it piece by piece. For a while, RTD was really concerned about whether or not they were ever going to be able to finish it. They considered going back to the voters and asking for more sales tax increase, but they decided not to do it because it just wasn't the right time to do it in 2010, 2011, 2012. So eventually they did latch on to the idea of maybe they should explore public-private partnerships as a way of getting this system built out. Public-private partnerships have been used in a number of transportation infrastructure projects. They're a lot more popular in other countries around the world than they are in the United States, although they are starting to gain more traction here. The definition is that they're just a contractual agreement between public and private partners, and that they allow more private sector participation than is traditional. Private sector has always been involved to some extent. This is just a much bigger role. It comes in the various forms. Two of the most popular are the design-build type of PPP, in which a private entity is charged with designing and building the project. They have more freedom to be able to do what they want in terms of making changes. The more extensive one is the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain model, where the private entity has a much greater stake in terms of actually taking on the whole project and doing much more. So there is capital raised on the global market and invested in these infrastructure projects with the idea that the investors are going to be paid back with the proceeds that come from these projects. In this case, it would be the sales tax, largely the sales tax increase. So what happened in the case of Denver and FasTracks is that each of these components got repackaged. They got separated out so that they would become attractive financial instruments or packages for global investors to invest in. One of the first, and probably the most famous, is the Eagle P3 project. And this is the one that includes a line out to the airport. It's now referred to as the University of Colorado A line. University of Colorado actually paid, I think it was $10 million for their naming rights to have this line named for the university. None of the other lines are named, but that one is. Then there is the G line that goes out to Wheat Ridge and Arvada, out to the west, and then one section of the B line that goes up to Westminster. So those components were packaged together. These are all commuter rail lines. The earlier lines were light rail. These are commuter rail lines. And a consortium was put together to fund this thing and to build it. RTD partnered with a group called Denver Transit Partners to do this Eagle P3 project. They got a lot of federal funding to support it. This project was one of the first that the FTA, Federal Transit Administration, was willing to support through their Penta-P program, which was a pilot program to encourage more transit agencies to investigate public-private partnerships. So this is the first and still the largest P3, transit P3 in the country. It's a 34-year project, 6 years design build, and then 28 years of operating and maintenance. So the private entity is charged with operating and maintaining this thing for another 28 years. There are incentives and penalties in the agreements that the private consortium has to be able to build it on time. They have to do it with certain financial parameters, certain targets that have to be met. And if they don't, then there are penalties that they will have to pay as part of the process. So this is starting to become a more popular way of being able to fund and finance these large-scale projects. This one of the research studies that I was involved with recently was assessing transit P3s, and by mainly focusing on what was going on in Denver. And we came up with some basic conclusions about it, and that is that they did have an accelerated delivery. There's no way that Denver would have been able to build as much as they have unless it were for these P3s. So they have been able to jumpstart the process and get these rail lines built a lot faster than would otherwise have been the case. There is the question about the appropriate allocation of risk, so that there is a risk that's taken by the private sector. They're investing in it. They think they're going to get a return on it. The public sector is willing to pay a little bit more to the private sector in order to get the project started and have a more stable entity that can be building it in a more stable financial stream. On the downside, and the shortcomings, these things are very complicated, very difficult to explain. Change orders are more difficult, and the upfront costs can be higher. Transparency is a big problem with these things. You don't always know what's going on, and that could be a problem if things go wrong. If everything goes right, it's not a problem, but when things start going wrong, it's nice to know, it's nice to be able to have access to that kind of information. And it's not altogether clear that the private partner in these cases will be, is required to provide a lot of the specific information. So with that, this is the current status of the FasTracks program. Of the 140 miles total of rail and bus rapid transit, 95 have been built thus far. The W line to Golden, which is this blue line here, was built in 2013. Denver Union Station was redeveloped and reopened in 2014. The University of Colorado A line out to the airport was opened in 2016, as well as the B line up to Westminster, and the BRT line, which is this blue line up to Boulder. So BRT was the only part of this that's non-rail, and that was the part that was finished up to Boulder. The R line through Aurora, which is over here, this green line, that was finished in 2017. It's expected that the line to Arvada will open in 2018. This has been delayed because of some problems with gate crossing technology on the A line to the airport. The gates come down too early, stay down too long for traffic then to be able to pass. As a result, the Federal Railroad Administration and the Colorado Public Utilities Commission have instructed that crossing guards be manned, the people there at each of the at-grade crossings, to ensure that drivers do not try to go around the gates either before or prematurely after the train goes by. And so it's cost millions of dollars to post actual guards at each of these grade crossings. Until that's actually worked out, there is no testing that's being allowed on this G line because they're using the same technology. So it's really put a hitch into the progress of the build-out. Southeast extension to Lone Tree, which is just this little extension, has been funded, at least in part, by communities down to Lone Tree. They wanted the rail line to come to them, and they actually put some of the money in towards building the rail line so that it could be extended farther to them. It was an interesting case of the public entities there, the city itself contributing to make sure that the rail line came up. The N line to Thornton, which goes north up here, this purple line, it's expected to be finished 2020, although no definite date has been given. The only line that is still outstanding is this green dashed line, which is a commuter rail line, the Northwest Rail Line to Boulder and Longmont. This is a troubling, problematic line. When the FasTracks plan was first put together, the estimates of costs on this line were considering that the freight railroad that owns the right-of-way there would eventually be selling at least some access to their line for not so much money. Well, as it turned out, the freight railroad had different ideas about how much it would be worth to have access to that corridor, and RTD substantially underestimated how much it was going to cost. And so when they finally got down into real negotiations over how much it was going to be, the cost was exorbitant. And I think that one line in itself was estimated to be somewhere about $1.5 billion. So it just was way beyond what they were going to be able to pay for. And so that line has been at least temporarily put on hold. RTD claims that it will be built eventually, but they're saying that the estimated date of completion will be sometime in the 2040s. So it's going to be a while before that actually happens. This has created some regional tension, as you can imagine. People in Boulder and Longmont have been paying that 0.4% sales tax since 2004. Boulder, at least, is getting a BRT. Longmont is getting nothing out of this. So they are not at all happy about this. The Northwest area has been very upset, and they continue to work with RTD, or try to work with RTD, to figure out a way to be able to get that line built. But so far, it's still at an impasse, and doesn't appear that that's going to be happening anytime soon. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just quickly shift into the second component of the talk, and this is rail transit and urban form. So very briefly, I'm going to just go over some of these basic things. These are things I think that for those transport geographers here, you understand the land use and transport theory, that the transit and any form of transportation provides access to various activities, and thus, the land values near those things increase, land use activity changes as a result of that. So it contributes to this interactive circular relationship between transportation and land use. One affects the other, which then affects the other in turn. So it's a positive development. This is another fairly famous diagram that comes from many urban geography textbooks that shows the evolution of metropolitan areas in the United States in relation to stages of transport development, from the walking horse car era to the electric streetcar era to the automobile era, both recreational as well as freeways and outer beltways. Metropolitan areas have grown farther and farther out and have become much more spread out, lower density development. So the question that I've been thinking about, and I know a lot of others have also been looking at this as well, is what do you do, what can happen when you put transit lines onto a landscape that has already been expanded outward under the influence of the automobile highway system? Is it possible for these transit lines to refocus higher density development around the stations, around the corridors, within a landscape that has already been under the influence of automobiles and highways? And that's a really intriguing question, and one that I continuously think about, and much of this research that I've been doing on this topic is really geared to. So in this diagram, I've put in red lines to indicate these rail transit corridors. And so is it possible to see sort of a refocusing of development along those transit lines and along the centers that are served by those transit lines? Will we see that? Under what conditions can that be created? And that leads me to consider the case of Denver and transit-oriented development. Since the first rail line started going in Denver, there has been a considerable amount of development in the transit station areas. RTD has been monitoring this since 1997, and they've been counting up the number of housing units, hotel rooms, retail space, office space, and institutional land use in 1/2 mile areas around each of the rail stations that are being built in the rail transit network. And it's been pretty considerable. It hasn't been consistent over time. Certain periods have been a lot more busy, a lot more activity going on than in others. For instance, in this one year here in 2010, you can see that there's a lot of institutional land use that was developed that year. Much of that is a result of a big medical complex that was built out in Aurora along the R line. It's the Anschutz University of Colorado Health Sciences Center. So it's become the major medical facility, and it is served now by a light rail line. So that's been a positive development. There's also been quite a bit of residential and hotel development going on around stations over this time, and it's been picking up in recent years as a result of the population growth in the Denver metropolitan area. I mentioned that the metro area is now over 3 million population. The city of Denver just recently went over 700,000. City of Denver has grown by 100,000 people in the last 7 years. In 2010, census said it was 600,000, and as of last year, it's up to 700,000. So it's been pretty dramatic growth just in the city itself. And a lot of that is happening in and around these TOD areas. I must say that the city of Denver has done a pretty good job in terms of planning for TOD. They've developed a station area typology in which they've laid out zoning, changes in zoning for the TOD areas to encourage more development around the TOD stations. They also came up with a plan in the early 2000s called Blueprint Denver, which identified areas of change and areas of stability. And all of the TOD districts were areas of change. So these were places where there was encouragement of more active development, higher density mixed use activity centers around the stations. So they've been very deliberate in terms of planning for and encouraging this type of development around the station areas. The biggest impact by far has been in downtown Denver. 46% of residential, 49% of office, and even larger percentages of cultural and hotel and government. And much of that within and along the central corridor has been at Union Station. Union Station has really stuck out in terms of the amount of building that's going on, both in terms of, in this diagram, office on the left and residential on the right. It's been a focal point for an incredible amount of development that's happened as the station itself has been rebuilt. In 2014, when the new station was reopened, the director of RTD at the time, Phil Washington, who's now the director of transit in Los Angeles, referred to Union Station as the mother of all TODs, and he got a few chuckles out of that one. But in many ways, it's actually really right, because there's just been a tremendous amount of building around Union Station. And the station itself, this picture here shows what it looks like today, has become a real focal point for development and for activity, a social hub of downtown Denver. One of the developers who was involved in this project, Dana Crawford, who was responsible for bringing back this area of downtown called Lower Downtown, preserving the buildings through historic preservation and reconstituting the area, referred to Denver Union Station as Denver's living room. And she wanted this to be a place where people could come sit on couches, play shuffleboard, work on their laptops. And every time I've been down there, there are always people there, and they're doing things. They're having a drink, they're having something to eat. There's a hotel right there in Union Station as well. So it has become a real focal point for the region. This is a picture that shows the Union Station area just behind the station as of 2012. Here's the station itself, and all of this was just open rail yards before the reconstruction began. Not used at all, just really open space. This is what it was like 4 years later. Incredible building that went on. Union Station itself is like right here, and all of this behind it has all been done just within the last 5 years. Every time I go down there, I see another building popping up out of the ground. It's been just a remarkable transformation of what's gone on. It's kind of shifted the focus of downtown to this area, away from the other parts of downtown. So this led me to think about, well, what's happening overall in terms of the impact on urban form? Is this really having an impact? Are we seeing a major change? We know there's a lot of activity in these TOD areas, but how does it compare to the region as a whole? Has there been more development within these rail corridors than outside these rail corridors? So this was the subject of a study that one of my students and I did a few years ago, where we looked at what was happening in each of these corridors and compared it to what was going on outside. And so what we found is that if you look at land use overall, change in land use, there is not a significant difference between what's being built inside the corridors versus what's being built outside the corridors. However, when you break it down by type of land use, then you do see some significant differences, particularly in commercial land use. In commercial land use, there's a significantly larger amount of development happening inside the corridors rather than outside the corridors. It's also fairly close for multifamily residential. And even though these lines here suggest it might be not so close, it is significantly different, but not by as much. But still, the numbers are more in favor of it. The area where you haven't seen as much is in single-family residential, which still tends to be outside of the rail transit corridors. And that kind of makes sense, because if you're trying to encourage more density, you want to see more multifamily units inside the corridor. So from that perspective, these results kind of show what the tendencies have been. We also did some mapping in this project to show what the intensity of change in land use has been like in relation to the corridors in Denver. And in the case of commercial land use, you can see here downtown, which really sticks out. This area here, which is the Denver Tech Center, another intense area. And then this area here, which is around Stapleton, and this area on the way to the airport. So there are some places that have been growing quite a bit in commercial within the corridor, but then there are also some areas here that are outside of these corridors. They're not served by rail transit. So it's not just within those areas, but it's happening in a lot of places. With mixed use, even though the total numbers are not all that great, much of that is happening within the corridor areas. Much less so. Multifamily is still pretty good, although it's, other areas, there still is quite a bit going on. And then single-family residential, not really so much as is to be expected. Overall, population density within the corridors has been increasing, and it's increasing more than what it is for the region as a whole. So we're seeing more densification occurring within each of these corridors, especially the central corridor, which has the highest density of any of the corridors here. This thinking with regards to using rail transit as a focal point for development and to try to encourage more high-density development has led the Denver Regional Council of Governments to come up with some pretty ambitious growth and development goals. They have set a target of a 10% increase in the region's overall density between 2000 and 2035. They also expect to accommodate 50% of the region's new housing and 75% of the region's new employment in urban centers, which are designated urban places, many of which are along the rail transit lines. And they also want to limit the number of households in semi-urban areas, places out on the fringe, to only 3% of the region's total households. Here's a map that shows the urban center centroids that were designated in 2012. Not all of them are along rail lines, but many of them are. And so the idea is to try to focus as much of the development in these centers as much as possible, and to have them be served by the rail transit or some form of transit, so that people don't always have to be relying on automobile transportation. Some of the early indicators showed that some progress was being made in terms of the percent of housing units built in the urban centers. This was up to 2010. I haven't seen the rest of this diagram since 2010. I don't think that the numbers are as high as it is right here. It's probably much, much less. Part of the issue is that the demand for housing within the urban centers and along the transit lines has been so great that it's been driving the prices up pretty high with all of the growth that we're getting. And so it's been a challenge to keep up with the demand for housing in these areas. A lot of people who would love to live there simply can't because the prices are just too high. A lot of the types of housing that are being built there are just at the very high end. And so it's out of the reach for a lot of would-be residents. And in terms of employment, you could see where it stands. Most of the employment is still in the non-urban centers, but the goal is to achieve more of a balance between the two by the year 2035, with an emphasis more on the urban centers themselves. So with that, I'd just like to draw a few conclusions, and then we'll have a little time for some questions. First of all, in terms of regional collaboration and transportation infrastructure, I think the Denver case illustrates that you can have a situation where there was intense animosity and suspicion and skepticism, which typified what was happening in the Denver region for a number of years, decades even, but that it can be turned around. The 1990s and the 2000s, there started to be changes in the way that the region thought of itself. Some of these new regionalist structures came in and really helped to forge an alliance and bring together these disparate entities to come around and try to solve some of these larger infrastructure issues. And so the support for FasTracks is a great example of that. It passed by a vote of 57 to 43, whereas in all previous votes for transit, it generally tended to fail by like a 60-40 margin. So something changed, the thinking changed, and there was widespread support. People were actively seeking the transit to come to their jurisdiction rather than keeping it away, which typified the previous period. So it really changed the viewpoint. And then with TOD, that's been another major thing that not only Denver Regional Council of Governments, but many of the municipalities, led by Denver, really actively embraced it and wanted to see that development intensify around the transit station areas and to really change the trajectory of urban form in the region. The way I'm picturing it and presenting it, it might sound like, this is some sort of idealistic transit landscape. And if you go there, you might be somewhat disappointed because it's not quite as idealistic as I'm making it out to be. There still are a lot of people driving in Denver. In fact, I think it's something like 75% in the metro area is driving alone. And even in the city of Denver, it's up to 70%, which is pretty high. But those going to downtown most of them are taking transit to commute. Transit mode share is higher than driving alone into downtown. And biking and walking have been growing quite a bit in the city and especially in downtown. So it's making an impact in certain places within the metro area. And at least now, we have a choice of the type of living environment that we like. You can live in Denver without having a car. It is possible to do that. So with that, thank you.
With one. I noticed that a couple of the rail lines were along interstate highways.
Yes.
25 and 225. So what lessons has Denver learned about putting rail lines along freeways?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Many of these corridors and the locations of the lines were chosen because they were the low-cost alternative. Some of them are in freight rail corridors, and then, like you said, some of them are along highways. Highway locations for rail lines are not the best from a TOD perspective because you're effectively cutting off one whole side from development. Whatever side the highway is on is basically cutting off any kind of development unless you build a bridge, a pedestrian bridge. And in some of these areas, they have done that. So it's made it easier to be able to cross over. But still, when you're in a highway corridor, it's not the most conducive for development. So it has limited the TOD potential of some of these station areas. Yeah, that would be what I would say. I think that because of the lower costs and the ease of acquisition of the right-of-way, it just made it a more expedient path to choose.
I know you focused on Union Station, which I absolutely love going to. Are there other stations along the rail line that have been, I would say from a suburban perspective, pretty successful in that area?
Nothing that has come close to Union Station. Union Station is just head and shoulders beyond what any other station's been able to do. I think there is some potential though for some of the other ones. The station at Stapleton has a real potential. Stapleton has been redeveloped. That used to be the old airport, and it's been redeveloped as a mixed-use, new urbanist, residential, retail, office neighborhood. And it's become very popular. Many people have chosen to live there. And there's a great potential for having a very nice TOD around the Stapleton station. Some of the other ones as well have some real potential too to become much bigger, much better. But so far, nothing has come close to Union Station.
So one more question. As in a metropolitan area, as a jurisdiction where we do find that we are kind of butting heads a lot of times with our big brother, has that type of regionalism continued through the years, or with the changes in mayors and elected officials, do they kind of ebb and flow with how they work together?
Yeah. The way I characterized it was like conflict and then collaboration. But no, it's not been so smooth.
Okay.
Generally, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s were conflictual periods. It started to change in the 90s and early 2000s, but it hasn't been a linear process at all. In fact, today, I think you can cite several instances where there's been significant discord between the city and some of the suburbs over other issues. There was a battle between Denver and Aurora over which place was going to host the National Western Stock Show and Rodeo. It's been in Denver since the early 1900s. Aurora wanted to take it away, and Denver said, no, we want to keep it here. And so, they battled over that one. So yeah, it hasn't been completely harmonious. But it's much better than it used to be overall. Yes.
To what extent is air quality a driver for move off the roads to the rail system?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people it is. It's a big factor. Like I mentioned before, Denver had a really big problem with air quality in the 70s and 80s. There was one sportscaster, I think it was during one of the Super Bowls where Denver got killed. They said, you know, Denver doesn't lead the nation in anything except carbon monoxide. And during that time, it was really a big, big problem. But they've done a lot to clean it up. They've instituted emissions testing and just overall a number of initiatives that have made the air much cleaner. VMT, well, has gone sort of, it had a period where VMT was going down, now it's going back up again, so that's been kind of up and down. We still have a problem with ozone in the summer, and so there are days where we exceed the standard for ozone concentration. But I think a lot of people are inclined to take rail transit and to not drive because of that, because they do want to preserve the air quality as much as possible. Yes.
So Denver has built a very hub and spoke system around one central area at a time when a lot of cities are building more gridded systems or systems with circumferential lines. I'm thinking of Los Angeles and the new Purple Line in DC. What are your thoughts on Denver's decision to go with a design that maybe a lot of cities are kind of leaving by the wayside?
Yeah, well, I think in the case of Denver, it did make a lot of sense, because many of the regional cultural institutions are in downtown. The sports facilities are in downtown. The performing arts complex is in downtown. Art museums are downtown. So many of those regional entities are there. And so as a destination, it really does make a lot of sense for the rail lines to focus in on downtown. Now this, could have been a major issue, a regional issue, because, suburban jurisdictions might feel like, well, we're building all these rail lines and they're all, focused on Denver, so Denver's going to benefit from this. But I think what eventually occurred is that they just felt that, well, we want to go there too. We want to take advantage of what's in downtown. And we'd like to be able to get there without having to drive. So I think that's what led to the change in thinking about having that type of network and that it was going to work. I would expect that if we ever have a FasTracks Phase 2, another round of it, that we will see more of the circumferential connecting on the outer fringes, between centers. I would expect that we'd see more of that in another phase. But thinking about another phase right now is just too far out, especially when this hasn't been completed yet, so we'll see. Yes?
Does the sales tax initiative either fund or pay for transit-oriented development directly, or is guarantor, with the exception of the mentioned Union Station investment? Are there other places where it can either fund hard real estate assets besides the stops, or development, or provide a guarantee in a private-public partnership, or is it outside of the scope of the tax?
In the case of Union Station, RTD, along with the City of Denver, the State Department of Transportation, and the Denver Regional Council of Governments bought Union Station in the late 1990s. And with it came 19.5 acres of land behind Union Station. And so they were able to translate that and sell that land to developers. And the proceeds from that then helped them to retire their loans faster on the Union Station project, which saved them money, which then they were able to use to fund other projects. So in an indirect way, they were able to benefit and actually help pay for other FasTracks components because of what happened, what took off on land development at Union Station. So it's a little bit of an example of a value capture in that case. They haven't really been able to do that on the other areas. RTD is limited in the amount of land that they can purchase for transit purposes. So if they're building a station at an outlying area, they can pretty much just buy that land right there at the station, and they can't go beyond that. In the case of Union Station, it just turned out that the parcel was fairly significant, and it was prime land, and they were the beneficiaries of that. So in that case, it worked for them.
One of the comments that you made was that the federal government had sort of reduced its role funding much of this. Now, Donald Trump ran on one of his major platforms was building infrastructure. I don't know if you've looked at any of the details of what they're proposing, but are there changes you foresee? What is this great plan going to, or will it bring us a new form of urban transportation?
Yeah. Well, when I first heard that he was interested in $1 trillion for infrastructure, I was quite surprised and actually quite happy to hear that. But when I saw what was actually going to be put forward by the federal government, it doesn't come anywhere close to that. That's the bulk of it is still going to be at the state and local level and or the private sector in terms of funding and financing. So it's a very low percentage. I think it's only like 20% that would be funded by the federal government. So it sounds great at first, but it's not really putting up a lot to do it. So I don't see this as a brand new great era of infrastructure building, unless there's some other breakthrough that happens. But the way it looks now, I don't see it.
You had mentioned that like housing prices had raised a lot in areas that benefited from this new transit structure. Do you know if like demographics wise, like for example, like minority groups were pushed out of these areas because of like the rise in prices for housing?
Yeah. Well, this issue of increasing land values, increasing home prices, and displacement from gentrification is happening throughout the city of Denver. It's not just in the rail areas, but it is happening in some of the rail transit areas as well. And that's a concern. It's a big concern because people who've lived in these neighborhoods for their entire lives are being forced to move out because the prices are too high. If they're renting, their rents are going up. If they're owning, the property taxes are going up and they can't afford it. So the process of displacement is very real. There was a case just recently in November that struck a nerve. There's this coffee company called Inc. Coffee. I don't know if they have them here in Phoenix or not. But Inc. has several locations in Denver. One of them is in this neighborhood that's it's called 5 Points, which is a historically African American community, and went through a period where it was depressed, but now has come back and it's being gentrified. So Inc. Coffee has a store in the 5 Points neighborhood, and one day they decided to put a sign out in front of their store, and the sign read, "Happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2014. That sign didn't go over too well. There were a number of protests from community residents in front of that Inc. Coffee shop, and pretty tremendous backlash across the board. Of course, they apologized for it and said, it's a very insensitive thing to say, but, it was well after the fact that they did that. And so it raised a lot of issues that had just sort of been there under the surface. But with that, that kind of raised the issue of gentrification and displacement to a much higher level. And now it's getting a lot more attention. I don't know if there's anything that's going to be actually done about it, but there were a number of community meetings all around the city to talk about gentrification and what does it mean, and how can we try to preserve the character of neighborhoods in the face of these rising prices. So it's a big deal. It's a big issue. Yes.
I was wondering if the kind of the plans are thinking in rails and trains, and I was wondering if there is a role that other alternatives like rapid transit buses and other alternatives to to solve the urban and regional transportation problem, if they play a role there, what are the pros and cons of those other alternatives?
Yeah, well, bus rapid transit is one of the components of this FasTracks line, the line to Boulder. There are also some plans to expand bus rapid transit in the city of Denver. The FasTracks plan has been a good one in that it extends rail and BRT in a number of corridors, but it doesn't go everywhere. If you really want to have an effective transit system, you've got to have pretty ubiquitous coverage throughout the city. And there are city buses, but city buses are subject to the same congestion issues like we face when we're driving. So, one way around that is to have BRT, bus rapid transit, with dedicated bus lanes. Nothing else can use them except the bus. And so, City of Denver just recently voted for an infrastructure improvement package in November. And one of the components of that is to put in a bus rapid transit line along a major street, Colfax, east-west street, on the east side of Denver. It's the busiest bus route in the city. And so it makes sense to think about having a dedicated bus lane for that route. So they're going to put that in. And that's going to really be our first experience with true BRT. And we're hoping, that that's going to be a real success and might then lead to additional BRT lines throughout the city. I don't see us going in the direction of a major rail expansion anytime soon because rail is just very expensive. But I can see BRT being put in on a number of the major corridors throughout the city.
What will be the reference for because you say it's going to be the first real BRT there. What are you using as a reference, similar city?
Yeah.
Is using it successfully?
The reason I say first real one is that the line up to Boulder, the BRT line, is using a lane that is what's called a managed lane, which means that the bus can use it, but also high occupancy vehicle cars can use it, 3 or more people, plus anyone who wants to pay a toll and use that lane can use it. So it's not an exclusive bus lane. So it might be what you might refer to as BRT light. So it's not full-on BRT. The Colfax one is supposed to be full BRT. So that will be Denver's first experience with true BRT.
Thank you, President Goetz, for your presentation. You're talking about the BRT line to Boulder.
Yeah.
And that county that's paying into the 0.4% sales tax, and I think it's Longmont?
Longmont, right.
Is there any research that's been done regarding that location and extending BRT or some type of rubber tire system to that?
Yeah. There is a plan to investigate extending BRT up to Longmont, and so that may very well happen as well, because it's really, Longmont was promised to get this rail line, and they're not getting it anytime soon, if at all, and so at least they would have access to a BRT line. There have also been some proposals to extend the North Line, which maybe I can show that here. Wait, is that, oh, there we go. I could, to extend this North Line and bring it over to Longmont so that it could tie in to there. And this one is easier because RTD already owns this right of way. So it would be cheaper to do that, but they haven't yet decided that that's what they want to do.
FasTracks was strictly transit, it wasn't multimodal, was it? Was it related to any ped, bike, dedicated to that type of infrastructure?
Not directly, no. No, it didn't have anything for bike or ped, although the cities that are part of this and the TOD areas have put in bike and ped infrastructure improvements in them. And I should also mention that RTD included in the Union Station redevelopment a bike hub at Union Station. So that part of it was in there.
All right, well, thank you, Andy, for a great talk. And,
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, especially those of you from the planning community and agencies who came here to ASU for it.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.